I think it's an incredibly important piece of work and conversation that we're starting, or continuing actually. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm in a privileged position at the moment, being able to provide grief counselling to people all over our northwest region, but I'm not a person with a disability. I'm not a disability support worker. I'm not on the front line every day with people with disabilities. You are the experts, even if you don't think so at the moment. So this webinar arose out of 2 years ago when I ran 2 workshops for the disability team at Melbourne City Mission. And I asked those 40 people who had actually had grief and loss training, either as their undergraduate studies or currently. Only 3 people raised their hands. So it's little wonder we're all here today, desiring more information, desiring more confidence. I ran a similar workshop for our homelessness division. So much of this was team building for these people. It was good self-care for the workers. It allowed us to name and normalise a lot of their experiences of being with grief and even grieving themselves. And here we are today. The consortium and the advisory group have been listening to the sector, and they know that this is a gap. And I could feel the energy as we organised this day today. It's actually hard for the general public to find appropriate grief counselling and support, let alone for people with disabilities. It's not that accessible. 2 weeks ago, we had an incredible full-day forum run by the National Disability Service and the consortium, and many of us here were possibly there. And loss and grief and dying were spoken about passionately and honestly. And at that presentation, I got permission from 3 people, from Mary, Uli and Heather, who shared their own lived experiences, to use their words in this presentation. So my objective today is to leave you feeling affirmed that what you're doing is probably good grief support, and to give you a real confidence boost and encouragement. Today I'll give you a very broad overview of the issues, some of which were presented at the forum, but for those that were not there, I think it'll be a good summary. And there's a lot of what has been expressed from people like yourselves at the coalface. I'll present a bit of theory and hopefully give you reassurance, some tips and some strategies. But that's a lot in 1 hour. Hopefully we'll have time for some questions and answers, but put them in the chat and I'm very happy to attend to those afterwards if we don't have time. I'm not able to solve a lot of the practicalities you'll be facing every day. I am lucky enough to have a lot of counselling sessions for people with disabilities in our palliative care service. And I have conversations with families and my own family a lot, because there are people with disabilities in most of our families. But I hope what's offered here is really affirming for you all and gives you a good foundation to continue the good work that you're all doing. I also need to mention that my colleague Zoe was unable to be here today, and she sends her apologies, and I just acknowledge the hard work that she's put into this too, and I know that she's here in spirit. I need to just say this is probably going to be a moving presentation. There was a lot of frankness and openness at the forum 2 weeks ago, and we all here wouldn't be in this role and on this webinar if we didn't deeply care. Grief and loss touches us all, but it also triggers our own anxieties and our own grief. It's a universal experience, grief. No one is going to get away scot-free or unaffected. Some of you today will certainly have disabilities, or you will be caring for a loved one with a disability. As we start talking, you may be relating this to people that you love, as well as your clients. Or ourselves, we might have our own disabilities and feel quite moved by the topic. So be prepared for that, and that's okay. We recognise in this hour you might leave and need to seek out a listening ear or look after yourself afterwards. This is our agenda today, a little bit of Grief 101. Then I'm going to step into the shoes of people with disabilities. Then I'll step into your shoes and look at just what we're facing as workers in the field. And I'll also offer up some fantastic resources, many that were gathered at the forum as well. So, just what is grief? It's good to start with some basic definitions. A loss occurs when an event results in long-term changes and has negative consequences. And grief is our response to that loss, that change, which is normal and natural and inevitable. Bereavement is specifically referring to the death of a person, and mourning is a term often used for the cultural or the outward expression of grief. And I often say when you're in grief, it would be abnormal to feel normal right now. But if we consider people with disabilities, maybe this constant layer of grief is their normal. Grief comes from a Latin word meaning heavy and burdensome. That's a good word, isn't it? It's a good definition. People with disabilities learn to carry their grief along, often with depression or trauma, but they're also adaptable and resilient, and they have to be. And as I heard at the forum, people adapt to live with that, often using black humour to help them normalise it. We see such resilience. So what is grief like? I love this handout. I often give it to clients. I say to them, underline all the words that you've felt in the last few weeks. Maybe put a tick against those that are sitting with you now. And then I say, no wonder you are exhausted. There's a lot going on. So when we consider living with a disability, you could overlay this with many similar words that relate to their lives with continual challenges and their experiences. A whole other layer of coping. And many of these words will overlap. So grief is inherent in much of their lives. So what actually is the impact of grief? We know it's so much more than our emotions. It affects the whole of who we are. It affects the main emotions that I come across all the time. There's the sadness, the despair, the yearning, the regret, and the heightened anxiety. Our body responds. It's very much impacted. High adrenaline and cortisol affects our digestion, our thoughts, our motivation, our energy levels, our sleep. Our spiritual selves are affected. We ask big questions. Well, who am I without them? How do I manage this change? What's going to get me out of bed in the morning? Why do these hard things happen? What's the point? Relationships are challenged. Sometimes the people we expect to step up can't. Sometimes we're tiptoeing around. Sometimes wonderful strangers are the most supportive. It's very social. The social effects of grief are enormous. Our behaviours can change. We feel erratic, short-fused, withdrawn, frustrated, jealous, angry, all of those things. Our thoughts can be very affected. So neurologically, often bereaved people are finding it hard to concentrate, hard to use their memory. Grief is a very dominant thing. It invades people's thoughts a lot. So grief brain is real. So we do feel totally shattered when we've had a major loss, and there's not much in our lives that gets unaffected. Nothing feels normal. Now, if we're considering people with a disability, continual changes and losses can pummel people every day, shift so much of their lives time and time again in every one of these domains. So how come grief is different from person to person? Some people seem to manage okay, others feel very affected, even with responding to the same loss. Certainly grief is very individual. It's as varied as our fingerprints. There's no right or wrong way to grieve, even though we might have some judgment on ourselves or expectations of others. And over time we develop our own styles of grieving and get familiar with that. So when we need to support someone with a disability who is grieving, we need, of course, to account for their own particular capabilities and circumstances. It's definitely not one size fits all. And this reminds me never to make assumptions. When I see a person, regardless of their condition or abilities or challenges, I need to get to know them and what it is that they're grieving their way. Another big question: does grief get better over time? Are there phases? We like to talk about grief maybe coming in waves, that stages are probably not a useful thing. But maybe it looks a bit more like this. Intensity and a lot of tsunamis at the start, and then things can settle but get triggered from time to time on special days or just by reminders. And hopefully a settling occurs. Again, considering people with disabilities. Many people with disabilities might experience the intensity that's quite prolonged. It takes them a bit longer to stabilise. Or maybe there's layers and layers of loss that happens and one gets overshadowed by the next. We hope waves will settle over time, but there are ripples on ripples on ripples, and possibly the pond never gets to be still. Another question: are we ever over grief? When are we normal? Is there a timetable? When will we be well again? I speak a lot about growing around grief or learning to live with it. This is a fabulous little picture of Lois Tonkins. The expectation possibly is that we're like that first jar, and when a big loss and change happens, grief can fill us up. And over time, the expectation might be that it becomes a scar, that it's a little blip, and we're back to normal, our normal shape. But people, bereaved people, have told me that's not right, that doesn't feel right for them. In fact, Lois drew this jar as becoming bigger and bigger. We change with our grief, but the grief is still the same size. We learn to nurture it, we learn to comfort it, we learn to carry it with us. She says, in some ways the pain of grief remained much the same, but as time went on my world expanded, so it felt less suffocating. Logic says, of course, we learn to live with the loss. But if you've ever experienced a major loss, you know that the pain is just under the surface. So, if we're not over grief, but we learn to carry it and buffer it and cope with it, and it's always there. For the grief of people with disabilities and the continual implications of that, many of these griefs are hidden but very heavy. I can think of people with disabilities who might carry it lightly and might have adapted or managed, and others who don't get a break or stabilise but find their challenges really burdensome for most of their lives. Let's just step across into the lives of people with disabilities. It is evident as I listen more that their lives are continual striving and struggle. There's a constant burden of carrying this grief, and in fact many live with the harsh reality of dying prematurely. I read that people using specialist disability services in Australia have a mortality rate 4.7 times higher than the general population. Imagine living with that knowledge. The burden of grief is unfairly distributed then. So, let's just look at what are the losses for people with disabilities, for some of them. Of course, there's that initial diagnosis. It's the first experience of the grief, of things not going as planned. Perhaps it happens for the person themselves, or perhaps it's for their parents at birth. Maybe it happens later on in life, or the result of a traumatic event, or an illness or a disease. Grief about what never could be. I will never drive a car. Maybe I'll never get married, dress or feed myself. I heard it spoken at the forum, while I haven't lost anything, I don't have what others have. What else is there? There's all those changes that happen often in the disability trajectory. Often it's not static, but it changes and evolves. There are repeated and repeated losses. Losses like not being fully healthy, not meeting normal life goals, continual uncertainty. Changes in key relationships can be very profound because of dependence and reliance on others for support. The loss of a carer, changes to friendship and connection with your community, and often the death of an elderly caregiver or a parent. I supported a person who was a quadriplegic. His 80-year-old mother died. And he told me over that coming year, I've never felt so disabled before, because now he was completely dependent on support workers. His life was dictated by formal services. He had no choice, no other options. There are a lot of secondary losses. One big change has many ramifications. Possibly the loss of a role in your family, not so much laughter or freedom, the loss of memories that that person shared, the loss of future potential joys. So major losses have many ripple effects, particularly for people with disabilities who have limited choice or agency. A life-limiting illness that comes with a disability or on top of a disability requires living with that heaviness and that burden of that knowledge every day. In palliative care, it certainly changes how people live very much. So grief and loss are a constant companion, requiring attention and adaptation, perhaps for people with disabilities much more than our normative population. When does it start? When does it finish for people with disabilities? This is a good quote from a wonderful book. Our developmental and societal expectations are steeped with significance and meaning. Surrounding those expectations for people with a disability is a quality of life that should be had or should be enjoyed. The experience of loss is revisited over and over again. And as Yuli said at the forum, we're probably the foremost experts of death and dying. He has a wonderful sense of humour and a frank way of presenting the situation for him. Perhaps living with grief for people with disabilities is the elephant in the room. Living with this knowledge and this experience every day of your life is tremendous, but often it's unspoken, hidden and not named. Today we're speaking to that directly, and it's a relief And 2 weeks ago, again, I felt that relief very much. Openness and honesty. So alongside the positive affirmation and the celebration of lives of people with disability, we need to balance that with honest conversations. We need to name and acknowledge and normalise the grief and struggle inherent in their lives as well. Both is needed. Heather told us there's no escaping it. And Mary said we live with grief. It's in our DNA. Why is this so complicated? It's not just one loss, is it? There's anticipatory grief. It's what's going to come, what's going to happen, when will the change occur, when will I have to go to hospital again, when will I need a different sort of therapy, when will my carers change. It's non-finite, there's no beginning and end. It's hard to delineate when things are over and when we can relax. It's cumulative, it's heavy work, relentlessly adjusting to change is very hard. Of course it's unpredictable, it's ambiguous, it's hard to articulate exactly what the changes are or the loss is or why someone's affected like they are. And again, disenfranchised is a wonderful way to name that society doesn't recognise a lot of these griefs and these losses for people with disabilities. It's hidden, perhaps there's shame, perhaps it's just too messy. So when we stand back and consider all these factors, I'm struck by the complexity that's overlaid often with trauma and stigma and depression. We're asked to be trauma-informed in our work in the last few years, and that's given a wonderful lens and awareness. But I'm learning to be more disability-informed too. And even though we here are very sensitive and aware, of course we are working in this field, there is still a lot of protection and isolation for people with a disability who are kept at arm's length from rituals, from discussions and from distressing situations. So often because of that, the world might seem scary and uncertain and messy, and well-intentioned people just want to care and shield others. On the whole, our community might have a lack of understanding, education, or familiarity with this. And this goes hand in hand perhaps with undervaluing people with a disability. Therefore, grief support for people with disabilities is very limited indeed. It's shied away from perhaps by the service sector, by other grief counsellors. Makes them nervous, makes them uncertain. Perhaps grief support is actually only for the most advantaged in our community, the most powerful and financially able to source it. Who else is affected by the grief for people with disabilities? We don't stand alone ever, we're surrounded by a network. Let's have a look at that system. Of course, in the middle is the person with the disability experiencing the challenge. They're primarily affected, but the loss and change and the grief ripples out. How many of us have sat and listened to parents and their distress and their worries and their concerns and their grief, and siblings? I ran a sibling program for 10 years. That's what we were doing, addressing the effects on them. And parents are acutely aware of the impact on other children, on their marriage, on their friendships, on every part of their lives. So too, support staff are incredibly affected. All who are involved in support, formal or informal, it's actually you who may actually have the most knowledge or opportunity to be involved in these changes and these responses. We heard at the forum of all the peers, the co-residents and the friends of people with disabilities are all impacted when a change happens, when someone dies, when there's shifting. There's a knowing in that peer group that what they share is a deep understanding and an awareness, and that's very special. Again, Uli at the forum shared his experience that his schooling was constantly interrupted by deaths. However, it was unacknowledged, it was not addressed. Death was never said, just assumed and avoided, he said. I can only imagine how hard that was for the students and the friends, the teachers and the families back home. Everyone in that situation had grief and perhaps trauma. So a person-centred approach is vital because each situation is different and each perspective in that network is important. Have a little deeper look at different challenges for people with disabilities and what actually influences their own expression of grief. For people with intellectual disabilities or cognitive challenges, we need to think harder about what we're seeing and how they express themselves and how they're processing their grief. Early developmental theories and grief theories suggested that we only grieve if we're capable of understanding the finality of death. Children too were assumed not to grieve, and this somehow still keeps happening. But in this space now, we know that grief is expressed in many forms, and no matter what your capability, you're affected and you do grieve. It's not just a sophisticated verbal expression, but they're symptoms in many domains. For many, each loss comes on top of many prior losses. Grief is already in the room. To understand each loss, we need to know the history of the person's life experience. We need the context the grief exists in. What's happened in the past? It might serve as a strength. It might build resilience and familiarity. They might have understanding based on previous opportunities or events. They might have skills. Or conversely, it may be a vulnerability in a wound that's getting reopened. One grief often triggers processing of previous griefs as well. Secrets and silence can be very unsettling for anyone. So excluding people with disabilities from factual conversations can create fear and confusion. Being protected from important events, from difficult news, or from witnessing someone declining and dying, for not taking part in rituals, being kept out of conversation. It's certainly not helpful, and it can lead to insecurities where concerning things can evolve. People feel further isolated. It leads to thoughts like they made bad things happen or they were responsible. And imagination can take over and make up even worse scenarios if they're not being fully informed to their capacity. So in grief, sometimes people can feel confused and fearful and unsettled if they've been protected or not included. So yes, we need to offer insight and exposure that's appropriate to a person's capacity, and this can take very sensitive work, but it is very important to include everyone. The scope booklet that is really helpful talks about you can feel loss and grief by virtue of the fact that an important person in your life is no longer there. They also presented this terrific, picture of the different developmental or learning capacities or capabilities that helped me understand where people that I was meeting might be at in terms of their comprehension or their processing. Further, the next point to consider for different people that have different disabilities might be their life experiences, their background and their history. Have there been multiple losses? It's important to know when we're faced with an individual what skills and perhaps what fears already exist from prior losses and changes, and what else is going on in their networks. Perhaps there's many challenges happening all at once that overwhelm their capacity to cope. Are there changes in a primary support network? This, of course, is a major unsettling event. It can happen in many circumstances and ways. But how much involvement or agency has the person with the disability had in that change? Have they been given a voice in this event? Sometimes it seems as it's normal for a person with a disability's life to be uprooted by a shift in carers or funding, or even the expected death of an elderly parent. But it certainly is not normal and shouldn't be considered every day. Trauma, depression and misdiagnosis can overshadow what might be a very understandable grief reaction. There may be a tendency to ascribe any emotional or behavioural change to the disability itself, rather than seeing it as a justified and understandable grief symptom. Let me explain. Grief can be minimised or excused as something else. I hear of regression in daily living skills and a dysregulation in emotion, an inability to contain. I hear people worried that someone has memory loss, confusion, or maybe dementia, when it's actually the grieving brain temporarily reacting to stress and change. Research has shown that caregivers underestimate the impact of grief on individuals with an intellectual disability, even when the affected person is clearly able to express their sadness and anguish. Most people with disabilities have deep experiences from a very young age, and Heather pointed out at the forum there's no escaping it. The third thing that influences a person with a disability expressing their grief might be their communication capacity and how they're communicated to and the support that's around them. So, we need to account for the diversity of communication styles and therefore their needs. There are resources like English easy language tip sheets and storyboards that are out there, specifically on the subject of grief and dying, but are we using them? It's important to really know the person's own beliefs and their schemas, their way of thinking in the world and understanding, and match our communication with their methods. Often use their words and their metaphors, whatever's familiar. And we really, please, don't use jargon, don't use euphemisms. They're too hard to grasp and they cause confusion. How often do we catch ourselves saying something just plain silly because we're avoiding using words we think will upset someone else? We need to utilise both verbal and non-verbal ways to help people make sense of this, meaning making. Making sense of the new world, responding to the loss and change is a central task of grieving. Rituals, photos, stories, familiar clothes, mementos are all ways to connect with the person or the change and process what's happening. And these things are so important when maybe language isn't available. Behavioural changes are a way that we can see people are grieving. Perhaps they're our clearest indicator in grief with some people with disabilities. Regression is really common. Outbursts, withdrawal, hitting, stemming, fidgeting, nightmares, impatience. They're all pretty clear signs of grief reacting to a loss. So my thoughts are, how can we help Someone used their bodies to release some of that adrenaline, some of the intense feelings, the frustration and the upset. It's probably inadequate, these descriptions, and I think you in the room have much more experience than I might in understanding each person with their disability and their special ways of processing the world. But I hope that's given a bit of an overview. Let's move across to working in the field. It's hard work. We are impacted by the grief inherent in the world of disability. Firstly, because we're just human and we care. More specifically, witnessing someone's struggle and pain, the pain of grief, can make you feel helpless and unprepared, both of our own feelings and managing their experiences. You see the impact and you can't change what's happening. When you witness suffering, when it's someone you know and perhaps love, when they're changing as they decline or they struggle, it's hard work. We feel helpless when we're sitting with grief. That's inherent in this work and this experience. And in a way, we're meant to. When a relationship ends, we feel grief. Maybe it's the death of a client. Maybe it's a shift change. Maybe it's a finish of your time of work with them. The connection has been real and the loss is real, even if it's our job. But this is your livelihood. This is how you put food on the table. This is your profession. And you need, when there's change, perhaps you've finished with a client or they've died, you need to turn up tomorrow, potentially, and hold space for the next person. And maybe there's no time to grieve. There's no recognition of that loss for you. Grief and loss and disability is laden with our own values and our own ethical dilemmas. We witness a support system that's inadequate and siloed. We witness unfairness and disadvantage every day. That's hard. That impacts on us. And we have expectations of ourselves to remain professional and remain untouched. What a pressure. Can we just remain objective when something very upsetting has happened? And maybe there are no rituals at your place of work to recognise the grief and loss. There's not actually permission to feel that and process that and be affected. It is impactful. We grieve often in our work. How do we sit with grief? How do we accompany someone's grief? You are skilled, and in fact you are experts in being with people with disabilities who need empathy, care and sensitive support. You have a toolkit already. There are some things to keep in mind. This might be reassuring for you. I hope it is. Firstly, we don't need to fix. We don't need to have good advice. We don't need to be experts in this. It's okay to just listen and be in the grey and share the helplessness of this situation. Be curious, be inquisitive, be caring. Of course, reassuring someone that all the feelings are okay. And in fact, in that, helping to name those feelings, helping people normalise those feelings. It helps move that in the brain when you've got some way to process and label and articulate. Allowing someone to have a lot of repetition when they're grieving, to search, to check for the person that's gone, to go over the experience again and again. A lot of reviewing is needed, and storytelling, and hearing responses to help make sense of this. Again, like I said, clear communication without abstract terms is vital, appropriate to the person's level and capacity, of course. Talking about the reality of the loss is really important. Sitting with silence is also actually helpful. It's different from not asking or from minimising, but we open the door, we make space, we invite people, and if that's not taken up right now, that's okay. Just keep that door open. Helping people participate in rituals, again, continuing bonds with what's changed or the person that's lost is really important too. It keeps us connected, it helps with reality, it helps with processing grief. So inclusion. Regression is okay. It sometimes sitting with people who are bereaved or grieving, it requires patience and flexibility, and we need to be non-judgmental about that. And at that point, maybe it's okay to seek out bereavement specialists for consultation or behavioural changes, some advice if those things are persisting. Routines are so important for people who are grieving, helping reset a routine that's been stirred up and changed, or maintain a routine that adds to a feeling of security and predictability. Our routine is important as well. And taking a time off from grief is essential to surviving grief. It's healthy and protective. It's not being in denial. It's actually allowing your body to calm. It's allowing yourself to be normal. Perhaps play or distraction or just being just you and not sitting with the heaviness of grief all the time. Children do this well. They need to play. Their bodies inherently say, that's enough. I just need to be normal. They dip in and out of their grief, and perhaps people with disabilities need permission for that as well, and facilitation. Just a few minutes now, we're going to move on to the world of death and dying and palliative care, and I'll touch on this lightly. Yuli spoke at the forum profoundly. Don't hide it from us because we know. When someone is dying, whether it's the person with the disability or someone important to them, we do need to be inclusive and honest. And sometimes that's very much avoided. We have to be brave, Heather said, in talking about grief and death. Leaving it until tomorrow is not good enough. So it's not okay to assume someone else will do it. Believe me, we come across that often in palliative care. People come without having clear discussion about why they're being referred. It's not okay to leave it for someone more qualified either. A lot of professionals tiptoe around it. We know the person best. Sometimes it needs to be us. Honest information and discussion is actually best done with someone who's trusted in a normal setting as possible. So whomever is known to them and knows them best, if they can be present at least for the majority of the time, to be available for follow-up and support. Going to them with appointments and hearing the information and being available to interpret that again and again is important. Of course, you can get support from experts, from palliative care staff, from doctors or teachers, but many people with disabilities need information repeated and drip-fed continually and reframed as they need more information. So the longer that something is left, the bigger the task might be and the more uncertainty is felt. But advocates like Heather and Yuli have told us clearly the person's probably already aware to some level, and we do need to be brave. Who else but us? Let's name some of these challenges when dying comes. Death and dying makes us anxious. It can be scary and unfamiliar. However, the palliative approach is actually the approach you're already taking in the disability sector, being person-centred and finding out their needs and the way they need to process this their way is important. We are concerned that we're going to make a situation worse at times by bringing it up or saying the wrong thing. I put my foot in it a lot, but that's okay. We're just human. We don't have to have the right words all the time. We're authentic and caring, and that's important. We're never sure how to make something better, and we fear repercussions. That's understandable. We fear role drift. It's not my place to do this. We feel it's outside our scope of practice, and we sit with limitations of our own setting and our own job description and other people in the network perhaps needing information too. It's tricky stuff. It's not black and white. How do we support someone in dying or death or in bereavement when we feel we're not trained? There is a need for training for days like this, for conversations, for professional development, for peer support. We need to understand what tools are in place. Are there end-of-life care plans available? Who has those discussions? How do you do advanced care planning? Who's the medical treatment decision maker in this network? There are complexities that palliative care staff can help with. If not us, then who? It's not always clear and it's not always comfortable, but we shouldn't deny that it's not actually already part of our job. We're already stepping into this often. It most certainly is present in our work with people with disabilities. And you do have a lot of these skills, perhaps more skills and appropriateness than anyone else. I'm finishing up now. Oh yes, a disability support worker stated, I recognise that many of my clients were actually already palliative. My goodness, that's honest. So in essence, grief support is actually listening. It's good listening. We're all human and we know what it feels to deeply connect with another human who's in distress. And good grief support is often just standing by that person, being available. I call it getting into the mud with them, being with them, accompanying them. Think about when you've felt truly listened to. It's different from other conversations. There's a big trust and there's a huge relief when you feel accompanied. Feeling accompanied in the messiness of grief helps someone feel more normal, understood, and most importantly, less alone. A word about tears. Often I have a few tears with my clients. It's a signal that I'm moved by their distress. It builds trust. I guess I'm mindful that it's not about me, but about them. It can be something that signals in a different way from words, that you're joining and you're deeply understanding them. So tears can be okay. Supporting someone who's grieving is deep empathy, and that's a finite resource, and you can run out of that. How full is your bucket? It needs replenishing. It needs support when you're in an intense situation like this. We lead with compassion and kindness, and as a result, we also need to deal with ourselves with a lot of self-compassion. Dial that up. We need intentional and radical self-care in this business. We need to be looking after ourselves. The last few slides, I hope, are helpful resources, and we will send these out to you. So this is my world of loss and grief, and there are some fantastic places locally and websites to read. I want to bring your attention to, in the middle there, Gathered Here. It's actually an incredible website driven from a need to have more visibility and information about the funeral industry and about everything that goes with the death and dying. And it's a great place to actually look up quotes. If someone needs to arrange a funeral or get probate or make a will, there's figures there about the finances, about the basics and all the offerings, and it's completely independent. That's a great website. Okay, let's move on to resources for people with disabilities. There's a lot, actually, more than I thought. So English language resources are out there, easy to read resources, easy to interpret. Palliative Care Victoria has some great ones on death and dying and grief, pictures and easy to read words. The Northwest Palliative Care Consortium, Kathleen and her team have gathered a very good amount of resources as well, specifically around palliative care. The National Disability Services that helped with the forum 2 weeks ago have an incredible amount of information, both for professionals and for the direct support of people with a disability. Council for Intellectual Disability and the Department of Health in New South Wales. However, if you're going to download one, I would recommend this, the PEPA Guide, Program of Experience in Palliative Approach. This learning guide is specifically for people like yourselves, for disability support workers. It is a very comprehensive step through, easy guide on the breadth of information about palliative care and dying and grief. I recommend at your workplaces that there is time to have a look at this, that it's printed off, this material is left on benches, it's given to every new staff that comes in. It's very reassuring reading. The resources are out there. Finally, if you're with someone who's terminally ill, you're not alone. Absolutely not. Every region has a community palliative care provider. Melbourne City Mission sits in the Northwest region. Community palliative care goes into the home. Nurses come out. They have 24-hour advice. They have registrars, trained medical professionals who are very good at supporting palliative care, and they've got good links into all the inpatient services out there. The Palliative Care Advice Service is another phone number to pick up the phone if you're in charge of medications, if you see symptoms change, if you don't know quite where to turn. From 7 a.m. to 10 p.m, this is available for you. You are not alone in this work. There's a lot of good people out there. Thank you for your work sincerely, everyone. I hope that some of you have found this reassuring and realise that you know some of this already and are doing this beautiful work well and understand grief and loss in the world of people with disabilities. It's simply about caring, but also getting this reassurance and just sharing and speaking honestly about these subjects is a relief, isn't it? I want to thank the Northwest Metro Palliative Care Consortium. Kathleen and Karen and Michelle have run services on a shoestring and done an incredible work at developing all of these networks and bringing these voices together and building forums and sessions like this. It's incredible what they've achieved, and I do hope we keep going next year. Aaron for his IT skills and my colleague Zoe for their support in this as well. And finally, I want to thank you all for attending today and giving this important topic a lot of space in your lives. Thank you.